Hey there, and welcome to our Biology 101 lesson for this week. The lesson this week was all oriented around energy, and we then tied that in a little bit into how you use energy and nutrition. And so what we're going to do today is focus on some of those concepts, mostly from chapter 6 and 7, that relate to energy and how you use it and how it functions in the world. If you recall that a couple weeks ago I said the carbon cycle was going to be one of the unifying themes of our class, well, we're really going to spend some time revisiting that today, but then adding energy to that cycle to further your understanding of these concepts. So let's go ahead and get started here with our session 4, chapter 6 part of the lecture. And this chapter was all about energy, and energy is essential to life. All living things require energy, and if you recall, metabolism or the use of energy was even one of the requirements for life from chapter 1. The sun is the ultimate source of energy for most living things, and that's because the sun's energy is captured on Earth by photosynthesizing organisms, such as plants, which then passes energy on to other organisms in the form of food. And so let's get our diagram back here with our sun up here, and that sun is going to be sending down photons in the form of basically light energy to our plant. Here's our plant. And if you recall, that plant was undergoing photosynthesis. The plant was taking in carbon dioxide and water through its roots, and it was using that to make sugars. Okay, but here we've mostly talked about matter so far. We've combined water and CO2 to make a sugar. Let's take a moment and look at our equation for photosynthesis. It's 6CO2 plus 6H2O yields C6H12O6 plus 6O2. All right, so we've got our big equation for photosynthesis across the top of the board here. And the thing is how are we getting from here to here? Well, the answer lies in this little arrow right here, and that's energy from the sun fueling photosynthesis. What we're doing is we're taking kinetic energy from the sun, this energy is kinetic, and the plant ultimately uses it to put potential energy inside these sugar molecules. And so the reason why plants are the source of food for all living things is because they're taking this inorganic world, making it organic, and putting and storing energy in these bonds. If the plants just did this on their own and nothing else followed, they obviously wouldn't be the source of energy for all living things. But we know that you have to survive too. And what do you eat to live? Well, you can eat plants, or you can also eat something that ate the plant. So we're drawing a cow. And that cow you could then eat to get energy. And so what happens is even though you are not photosynthetic, you do not directly capture energy from the sun to fuel your life, you are getting energy in the form of eating a cow or eating the plant. And so this works out pretty well, but is this process 100% efficient? Well, the answer is no. Let's say we started off with 1,000 units of energy in this plant. How much of that energy from the plant do you think goes into the cow to make basically cow meat, or well, beef? Well, it's not going to be all of it for two reasons. One, anytime we transform energy from one form of energy to another, some of that energy is lost as heat. What do I mean by that? Let's say you had a light bulb and it burns out. What happens if you go to change that light bulb very rapidly? Well, you'll feel that it's hot. And in fact, older light bulbs produced more heat than they did actually light. The job of the light bulb was to produce light. However, it's trying to transform electrical energy into light energy, and so some of that is lost as heat. And so in each of these stages, we're transforming energy, so we're losing some as heat. But also, living things have a metabolism. And the metabolism is the amount of energy used by each of your cells. And if we added all that up, we could get an organism's total metabolism. If I took the metabolism of each of your individual cells, added it up together, we could get a whole organism's metabolism. And so actually, when we move up the food chain, we lose some of that energy. Why? Because when this cow eats this plant, it doesn't take all that energy and directly convert it into cow meat. Instead, what's happening is we're losing some of the transfer, and this cow has its own metabolism. It runs around, it does stuff. And you can tell that increasing metabolism or that organisms lose energy as heat because when you exercise. When you exercise, what are some things that happen? Well, one, you breathe heavier, right? You're bringing in more oxygen. Two, you sweat. You're sweating because the use of all that energy is generating heat. You're turning chemical energy from the food you ate. So if this cow is running around, it's turning chemical energy from this into ATP and then ultimately into mechanical energy, and so heat is lost. And so what we have here is we lose energy as heat, and we lose energy as heat. So what this means is that each time we go up a trophic level, these are trophic levels, plants to a primary consumer to a secondary consumer, we're losing energy. So by the time you eat that food, you end up with only about 10% of the energy that was initially inside the cow and about 1% of what was in the plant. And so we're losing energy each time we work up. This creates an interesting phenomenon. Notice here we have that you are eating the cow which ate the plant. What if you ate this plant directly and we bypassed the cow? How much would you get? Well, we wouldn't lose a bunch on the cow's metabolism. So if we ate the plants directly, we would get 100 units of energy instead. And so this is why many people have chosen to be vegans or vegetarians for conservation reasons. Because if we have a farm, and let's say this farm had 10 spaces, and each space could grow a certain amount of food, and let's say it was 1,000 units, and we fed it to the cow, we could then feed one person with that cow, right? If each person, say, needed 100 units of energy per year, one cow would feed them. But we're losing that energy. So in this case, we feed one person. But what if we take that exact same farm, and instead of feeding what we grow to a cow, then feeding it to ourselves, we feed it directly to ourselves? Well, then in that case, each person could be fed off of one plot, and you get the idea, and so on. And we would actually need less farmland per person. The idea being that if you grow plants, feed them to cows, and then eat the cows, you lose a lot of energy as heat. But if you eat the plants directly, you take out that middleman, so to speak, and you keep that energy. And so if you need less land for farm, that's more land that you can set aside for conservation and other sorts of practices. Now keep in mind, this isn't 100% true, because for instance, there's some land that's not great for farming, but it's great for grazing, and a lot of us personally, I'm never giving up steaks. But this is a consequence of this energy loss for some people's diets. Also looking at this, if we're thinking about a farming, agricultural type situation, if we can reduce the amount of energy that's lost in this transition from here to here, we can perform a lot better. A general rule is that in natural systems, 10% of the energy makes it up to each level. But on farms, sometimes we can get that up to 20, 30%, because we're trying to optimize the growth of these animals while minimizing the amount of food we have to input. So farms can be incredibly efficient. Also, a consequence of this energy loss working through here is that you can only get so many predators up a food chain. So let's think about elk, plants, and wolves in Yellowstone. You grow some plants, and then let's say elk eat those plants, the wolves eat those elk. But do you think anything could survive eating the wolves? No, really. You couldn't imagine a specialist that went around just eating wolves because that trophic level has so little energy left that it really can't support another one above it. And so because of this loss of energy, we have a limit to the length of our food chains, which is exactly what we're drawing here. So let's go ahead and work through our presentation a little bit. And as we do so, we'll come back to this diagram and add components to it. Okay, so energy can be conceptualized as having two forms: potential energy, meaning stored energy, or kinetic energy, meaning energy in motion. And we saw some of that when we were looking at our we seem to have lost our camera feed here. Hold on one moment, please. We saw some of that when we were looking at there we go. We saw some of that when we were looking at our diagram before. Recall, on this diagram, we had the kinetic energy from the sun being used to store energy inside this sugar molecule. But then we also have kinetic energy over here. As this cow does stuff, we have energy in motion, but it also stores energy, we'll make the cow fat now, inside meat. Furthermore, you have the same thing. You have kinetic energy when you're doing things, moving your muscles, and so on. But you also have potential energy. Something could eat you. We'll give you a belly there too, right? Something could eat you for food. So let's go ahead and continue on here. Thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy is never created or destroyed, but is only transformed. And basically, the second law states that energy transfer will always result in a greater amount of disorder in the universe. And basically what we're saying here is that in every energy transaction, some energy will be lost to the most disordered form of energy, heat. And so all the time, the world is constantly generating heat and losing it. The Earth, all these reactions are going on. Heat is constantly being bled into the universe. And we showed you that on our figure here a moment ago, where we showed you the heat that was lost in this process. So what's interesting about living things is they can bring about local increases in order in themselves through their metabolic processes. So living things can undergo reactions, can organize random molecules. Photosynthesis is nothing more than grabbing the inorganic world and bringing it into the complex organic world, which also comes with storing some energy. But keep in mind, it took energy to store that energy, right? if we look back here at our example of photosynthesis, it took energy from the sun for us to build this. It's not like we magically put energy inside the sugar. We used energy from the sun to further this reaction. So, energy in living things is stored away in endergonic or uphill reactions, in which the products of the reaction contain more energy than the starting substances. So, sorry, we're having a technical difficulty there. So, what happens is that, sorry, we just got to check our screen here. Okay, so energy in living things is stored away in these endergonic uphill reactions in which the products of the reaction contain more energy than the starting substances or reactants. Conversely, energy is released in exergonic reactions in which the reactions contain more energy than the products. And we can see this in our photosynthesis reaction. We have an endergonic reaction which puts stored energy inside our sugar here. Then over here, what we're going to do is we're going to use that energy, we're going to break those bonds, we're going to make ATP and use that to fuel all the activities inside the cow. And same thing with you. You're going to make ATP to fuel all your activities. Now, keep in mind, plants can make ATP during photosynthesis. However, if they want to use any stored energy, they have to undergo the same sort of process as the cow or you. This is why plants also need mitochondria, as we noted last week. So, as we just mentioned, linking simple sugars to form complex carbohydrates is an endergonic reaction, and this will not occur without an input of energy. And conversely, the breakdown of complex carbohydrates into simple sugars is exergonic. It's releasing energy. ATP, as you read about and we mentioned, is the universal molecule for life. It basically functions to provide energy to all sorts of things that you do. ATP stands for adenine triphosphate. It's the most important energy transfer molecule in all living things. It's very conserved. Almost every organism uses ATP. As we mentioned before, in animals, energy that is extracted from food is transferred to ATP, and then this can drive a great many processes. And energy supplied by ATP is used, for example, to power muscle contraction, nerve signal transmission, and so on. Let's step away from our enzymes for a moment here and jump into a part of Chapter 7 for a second. And I want you to notice something here, and that is about the process of how we actually get ATP. And it occurs in 3 stages of what's known as cellular respiration. And basically this is getting energy from food, and we typically talk about this in terms of getting energy from a sugar. And it has 3 stages: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Some organisms can rely solely on glycolysis for harvesting energy, but for most organisms, glycolysis is just a primary process to get things going, because they'll ultimately use the electron transport chain. And one of the reasons this is important is because glycolysis yields 2 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose, as does the Krebs cycle, but the amount we get from the electron transport chain is 32 ATP molecules. And the key thing here that I want you to notice about this is, look, this electron transport chain has oxygen as the final acceptor. So we could have glycolysis and get 2 ATP. We could have the Krebs cycle and get 2 ATP, but we get a ton of ATP by using the electron transport chain. 1 glucose molecule, 32 ATP when we can use it, versus 2 when we can't. And so what does this mean for the real world? Well, remember when we were talking about the equation of photosynthesis? This time we left off, remember, plants put out oxygen, right? As a byproduct, and we can see that over here in our equation as well. And so that oxygen is critical to your survival and reproduction. And here's why. If you could not use oxygen, you could only generate 2 ATP per glucose molecule. With oxygen, you can generate 32. And so the difference here is 16 times a difference in ATP generation. And here's why that's important. It means that your cells are 16 times more efficient. Let's think about an example where you go into McDonald's and you're going to order a Big Mac meal, and you sit down, you eat your 1 Big Mac meal, and you're good to go. If you could only generate 2 ATP per glucose molecule, you would have to eat 16 Big Mac meals to get the same amount of food. That's almost impossible. You'd run into gut constraints, right? Can you imagine eating 16 full Big Mac meals? And you can think about a caveman. Do you think a caveman could hunt or gather 16 times as much food? Right? It's easy to even... In both examples, we run into a gut constraint even when food's easy to come by, but that much food would be really hard to get. And you can tell how critical this process is to your existence because of suffocating. Let's say that I was to grab hold of your neck and start to choke you. What would happen as time went on is that your cells would be unable to generate enough ATP to carry out their basic functions, and those cells would start to die. Keep in mind, there's some other things going on with suffocation there, not just the energy thing. But one of the fundamental things that happens is those cells starve to death due to a lack of ATP. That's why oxygen is so critical. The plants produce oxygen, and you breathe it in. Let's go ahead and continue with our other... another part of this I wanted to mention is that when you consider all this, well, where did that oxygen come from to begin with? You, as a large multicellular organism, animal I should say, require that electron transport chain to stay alive. But for a long time, the Earth did not have much oxygen. It only came about through plants over millions of years, billions of plants, adding CO2 to the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Till eventually there was a high enough concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere that made large multicellular organisms possible. And there are smaller organisms that don't need to generate so much ATP. Remember, we said some things can use just the Krebs cycle. And that's okay when you're a small single-cell organism. They can get everything in from its outside and go like that. With a large multicellular organism, you only have your digestive tract to send all the energy and everything you need to your whole body, and so it needs to be efficient with that 16 times electron transport chain. So, we saw a consequence of oxygen, another benefit of plants, and oxygen is important, as we already mentioned. Without the oxygen, it comes to a halt. You can't get the energy, and we already kind of talked about that. Keep in mind that I've been talking about glucose a lot here, or just sugars in general. However, different nutrients and the derivatives can be channeled through different pathways in cellular respiration in accordance with the needs of an organism. That's a mouthful that basically means we can use things other than just glucose to get energy. We can also process proteins and lipids for ATP production at different points. And so you can see here a schematic of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats all being able to make their way into that electron transport chain. So this is why this cow still has potential energy inside that protein in the beef, because we can release that energy as well and use it by eating it. And so we can eat cows, or we can eat cows and plants, because we can get energy from both proteins and carbohydrates. And obviously there's fats in here too. And so you can break down the proteins and fats to get energy. You can break down your own fats to get energy. And in extreme cases of starvation, you can even start to break down your own protein to get energy. So let's jump back to enzymes. So now we're going to kind of get off of the energy cycle, and we are going to talk about specifically about enzymes. And so an enzyme is a type of protein that accelerates the rate at which a chemical reaction takes place in an organism. Technically, it does that by lowering the activation energy of the reaction like a catalyst. But I'm going to talk about it in a little bit different way today to really get at the point of what enzymes are. Nearly every chemical process that takes place in living things is facilitated by an enzyme. And so, for example, we could break down a carbohydrate into a simple sugar with an enzyme. And I think we brought this up last week. If you take a saltine and you put it in your mouth and you chew it, you start off with something that's starchy. Eventually, if you leave it in your mouth for a couple minutes, it'll start to taste sweet. And this is going on because enzymes actually start the process of carbohydrate digestion inside your mouth. And so when you think about biological processes, a lot of times we'll say that there's some process that's going on and A yields some result like R. Okay? A goes to R. However, rarely are processes that simple in biology. Most things going on inside your cells and body require many steps in order to be accomplished. It may look like A brings us to R, when in reality we had to go to B, to C, to D, to E, and so on. You get the idea. And most of these steps, or many of these steps, are going to be facilitated by enzymes. And so, as I mentioned, many metabolic pathways are controlled by enzymes. And in a series such that one becomes the substrate for the next. And so here's an enzyme at work. We start off with these two parts. The enzyme grabs it, puts it together. It yields. Then another one breaks them apart. Then another one puts them together in a different way. And so we go from these two things to a bent product like that. We already talked about the sum of all the chemical reactions is an organism's metabolism, and enzymes are very important in an organism's metabolism. As we mentioned, enzymes are catalysts. The substrate is what an enzyme acts on, and an enzyme will bind to a substrate with its active site. The key thing here is that enzymes will not be chemically altered themselves. They are globular-like proteins, and they look something like this. And so here's an enzyme, and it is binding to something to accomplish a goal. And when you think about enzymes, I want you to think about them like little robots, okay? Because let's say you had something you wanted to accomplish inside an organism. You could have things occur slowly on their own, or enzymes could facilitate that. Keep in mind, enzymes can facilitate many, many different things, because remember, proteins have our 20 Legos, our 20 amino acids. We can build anything. And so you can basically build all sorts of different enzymes that can do all sorts of different things, and these are like little robots that have one job. And that one job, say, maybe to break apart some molecule. And so what that little robot's going to do is it's going to find that molecule, take it apart, break it, and then it's done with it. And then it's going to go on and find another one, break it apart, and it's done with it. And while these caps may naturally one day fall off of these markers, if I have an enzyme to break that apart, it occurs much more easily. And that's how enzymes facilitate chemical reactions. they do the same thing over and over, acting on the substrate to turn it into a different substance. And so, for instance, taking it apart. We could also have an enzyme that would grab these two parts and put them together. Enzymes can do many things because of their diversity. But keep in mind, we also want to be able to regulate enzyme activity. And we can do this in several ways. One of them is competitive inhibition. In competitive inhibition, what we do is we bind something else to the active site of the enzyme. So if this was our enzyme here, we would bind something to the active site that resembled the substrate that that enzyme normally worked with. And if we bind something there that the enzyme can't work with, it can keep that site occupied such that the enzyme will no longer continue to do its job. We can also use allosteric regulation, where something else binds with the enzyme at a different site and changes its shape, thereby stopping it from functioning. And so, for instance, we could bind something on the back, like if this was a little robot, we could bind something here that acts like an off switch that stops us from functioning. Keep in mind, things get a lot more complicated than this. Sometimes something binding here may perform a permissive role, where once this binds, it enables it to do something. We can also regulate enzyme activity by having more or less enzymes. One of the coolest ways we can regulate enzyme activity is where the product of the reaction with the enzyme becomes something that inhibits the enzyme function. And so, for instance, if this enzyme was breaking things into two parts, one of those parts could bind to the enzyme and then reduce and then stop the enzyme from functioning. And this may seem crazy, like why would you want to regulate enzyme functions in that way? But let's say you had something that was going to work to turn your fats into sugars that your body could use. Once you had a bunch of sugars around, you'd want to stop working on those fats, right? You'd say, all right, we have everything we need, let's save these fats for later. And so by a sugar coming around and stopping the enzyme that breaks down fats from working, we could regulate that system. And obviously keep in mind, the example I just gave would have many, many steps between those two things. So we regulate enzyme activity to keep things functioning smoothly. Okay, so that is our lecture for today. There was a lot of chemistry and things going on inside the chapter. I hope that I was able to demonstrate how all of this relates to your daily lives and the way the world functions by putting it into this context. And with that, we will meet up next week for another lecture.